Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. The reinforced transparasteel window of the Tartarus atmospheric mining station groaned under the immense external pressure, vibrating with a low, bone-rattling hum. Drake Brower stood perfectly still before it, his face pale and unreadable in the dim emergency lighting. Beyond the scratched glass lay a suffocating abyss, an endless, boiling ocean of blood-red storm clouds swirling over the rusting gas giant below. There was no sky here, only a crushing weight of methane and heavy metals that swallowed the light of the distant sun. The ambient temperature in the observation deck was hovering just above freezing, but the cold radiating from the station commander's voice felt infinitely worse. For direct insubordination, dereliction of duty, and the unauthorized diversion of military resources to assist a civilian refugee transport. The commander read from a heavy metal datapad, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. You are hereby stripped of your rank. You are reassigned to Vanguard Squad 9, effective immediately. It was an unofficial death sentence. Every soul trapped in this cursed mining sector knew it. Vanguard Squad 9 was the disposal unit for the station's worst elements, sent into the most lethal gravity wells, where survival rates hovered near 0%. Drake said absolutely nothing. He simply unclipped his silver officer insignia, dropped it onto the cold steel table, where it landed with a hollow clink, and turned his back on the commander, walking away toward the lower quarantine airlocks. The holding bay smelled of scorched ozone, stagnant water, and highly oxidized metal. The overhead lighting flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged, and distorted shadows across the heavily graded floor. The air inside the room was incredibly dense, pressing heavily against Drake's chest. As the massive blast doors sealed shut behind him with a final, heavy thud, Drake came face to face with his new executioners. Crouching in the shadows to his left was Kalen. The alien was a massive, four-armed amphibian nightmare. Its slick, rubbery skin pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic green bioluminescence in the dim light. Its four deep gill slits flared violently with every heavy, wet breath it took, filtering the toxic air. Coiled tightly in the dead center of the room was Vorg. The creature resembled a terrifying, biological cross between a colossal centipede and a heavy siege engine. Vorg was covered from head to tail in thick, dark brown armor, plating that scraped aggressively against the floorboards whenever it shifted its enormous weight. Twin sonic cannons, grafted painfully and directly into its chitinous carapace, hummed with dormant, destructive power. Hovering completely silently in the far, dark corner was Zira. She was not made of flesh and blood, but existed as a swirling, volatile vortex of pure blue energy. This raw power was tightly bound within a heavily reinforced biocontainment suit that crackled with a highly dangerous electrical charge, illuminating the rusty walls around her. Kalen let out a wet, guttural clicking sound that translated roughly to a mocking laugh. Look what the upper command sent us to die. A fragile human. Look at that soft, breakable skin. It has brittle calcium bones that will snap under the first atmospheric shift. It needs to suck in pure oxygen every 3 seconds just to keep its pathetic, weak heart beating. Vorg shifted its massive bulk, its sharp mandibles clicking together in total agreement. Its internal organs will completely rupture the second the barometric pressure drops by even 10%. We will not carry your crushed, bleeding corpse when the heavy gravity well flattens you, human. Drake remained entirely silent. He did not puff out his chest in a show of false bravado. He did not hurl useless insults back at the giant beasts. Instead, his dark eyes quickly and efficiently cataloged everything. He noticed how Kalen's lower left arm favored a slightly different angle when resting, indicating an old, unhealed joint injury. He mathematically calculated Vorg's turning radius based on the massive centipede's rigid segmented armor, noting a critical 45-degree physical blind spot right behind its primary auditory receptors. He intently watched the fluctuating energy output meters on Zira's containment suit, memorizing the exact rhythm of her thermal cooling cycles. While these monsters saw nothing but a fragile primate, Drake was already quietly integrating their complex biological and mechanical data into his internal tactical matrix. They were living weapons. He simply needed to figure out exactly how to aim them. Before the heavy tension could escalate any further, the grimy holding bay was suddenly bathed in a harsh, rotating crimson light. The ear-piercing, terrifying shriek of the station drop siren tore through the metallic room, vibrating Drake's teeth. A cold, synthetic voice echoed from the overhead speakers. "Vanguard Squad 9, brace for immediate deployment. Your target is an ancient research installation. Designation Tartarus 0. All signal transmissions from the facility ceased exactly 32 minutes ago. Drop pod trajectory is locked directly into the eye of the primary atmospheric hurricane. Brace for descent in 10 seconds. The thick metal floor beneath them suddenly detached from the heavy magnetic locks. There was no countdown, no final safety check, and no warning. The armored drop pod simply fell out of the station's underbelly, plunging them straight down into the howling, blood-red, suffocating darkness of the giant planet below. The descent was not a calculated drop. It was an execution by gravity. The heavily armored pod plummeted at terminal velocity, smashing violently through the upper troposphere, where the immense atmospheric friction ignited the outer hull into a blazing, roaring fireball. Suddenly, a colossal magnetic storm cell, generating tens of millions of volts of raw atmospheric fury, collided head-on with their trajectory. The drop pod did not just mechanically fail. It was instantly and violently shredded into thousands of pieces of burning shrapnel. The heavy blast doors ripped away like wet paper, forcefully ejecting the four bodies directly into the blinding, freezing, and utterly chaotic maelstrom of the gas giant. There was no sky and no solid ground, only the crushing, absolute darkness of a hyper-dense atmosphere and the deafening roar of supersonic winds tearing mercilessly at their falling bodies. Instinct and extreme biology immediately took over for the alien convicts. Vorg reacted in a fraction of a second, curling his massive bulk into a tightly wound, aerodynamic sphere. The giant centipede's thick chitin plates interlocked seamlessly, deploying a secondary, shock-absorbent, hyper-dense armor layer that simply deflected the razor-sharp ice crystals and extreme barometric shock waves. Kalen adapted just as swiftly, spreading his four thickly webbed limbs wide. The heavy, methane-rich gas was so incredibly thick that it behaved almost like a liquid, allowing the giant amphibian to literally swim through the raging air currents. His bioluminescence left a ghostly, trailing green light in the chaotic dark as he forcefully navigated the violent downdrafts. Zira simply ceased being a solid physical entity. She bypassed the catastrophic kinetic trauma entirely by shifting her bio-containment suit into maximum overdrive, transforming her physical state into a blinding, piercing beam of concentrated azure energy that sliced cleanly through the brutal storm, completely immune to the physical tearing of the hurricane winds. Drake had no biological miracles to save him. He was a creature born of a gentle one-gravity world, completely unsuited for the hellish, brutal physics of this planet. The exact moment the pod shattered, the sheer kinetic force of the wind slammed into his chest like a solid wall of rapidly moving concrete, spinning his fragile human body violently out of control. The gravitational pull here was immense, multiplying his body weight drastically and pulling him down significantly faster than his alien counterparts. The extreme atmospheric pressure immediately began to crush his standard-issue survival suit. Horrifying spiderweb cracks exploded across his transparent helmet visor. The interior of his helmet flashed with strobing, blinding red warning lights as the artificial intelligence screamed that hull integrity had fallen below 15%. His bones groaned loudly, feeling exactly as though a massive industrial hydraulic press was slowly and steadily closing in on his ribcage. His oxygen flow stuttered violently, and dark, terrifying black spots began to dance rapidly across his vision. Panic, the ultimate and most efficient killer in the void, threatened to completely consume his mind. But humanity's greatest evolutionary weapon was never brute, physical strength, or impenetrable thick armor. It was advanced pattern recognition, pushed to the absolute brink of unconsciousness. Drake forcefully commanded his eyes to shut. He stopped fighting the overwhelming physical force of the wind and started actively listening to it. Beneath the chaotic, deafening roar of the hurricane, his highly evolved primate auditory cortex began to instinctively isolate specific frequencies. He listened intently for the subtle, fleeting shifts in pitch, the high-pitched screaming whistling of rapidly compressed gas, and the deep, booming resonance of heavy atmospheric pockets colliding. He actively mapped the invisible, deadly topography of the storm within his mind. By making microscopic adjustments, angling his arms and subtly shifting his center of mass, he steered his rapidly falling body away from the high-pitched screams of the crushing downdrafts. He slipped perfectly into a temporary, low-pressure air pocket that drastically reduced the violent friction and deadly drag tearing at his fragile suit. He stabilized his chaotic freefall, his breathing evening out into a steady, focused rhythm despite the flashing crimson alarms blinding his eyes. Suddenly, his suit's proximity alarms wailed a completely different, far more urgent tone. Directly below them, hidden entirely from the squad's standard mechanical radar by the dense, swirling metallic clouds, a monstrous anomaly was rapidly forming. A hyper-corrosive acid tornado, stretching several miles wide, was twisting violently upward, aggressively sucking the surrounding atmosphere into a massive, shredding vortex of highly concentrated chemical death. The alien team members, relying purely on their blind physical adaptations and their completely jammed electronic sensors, were dropping completely unaware straight into its gaping maw. Vorg's impenetrable armor would instantly melt into slag. Kalen's rubbery flesh would dissolve to the bone, and Zira's energy suit would catastrophically short-circuit the second they touched the caustic funnel. Drake violently ripped the heavy emergency flare gun from his thigh holster. He could not yell over the communication channels due to the intense magnetic interference, so he had to visually show them the exact path to survival. Calculating the extreme wind deflection and terminal velocity in a fraction of a second, Drake fired. A brilliant, blinding burst of magnesium white ignited the crushing dark, leaving a thick, glowing smoke trail that violently curved sharply to the left, completely avoiding the invisible, deadly funnel of the acid vortex. He fired a second, and then a third time in rapid succession, creating a perfectly illuminated, low-pressure slipstream corridor straight through the deadly chemical chaos. The visual message was universally clear: follow the human light. Zira instantly shifted her azure energy beam trajectory to perfectly trace the glowing flares. Vorg uncorked his massive spherical form just enough to aggressively angle his heavy descent along the bright, white smoke. Kalen forcefully swam his massive, muscular body into the exact slipstream Drake had meticulously carved out of the storm. Together, diving in perfect synchronization, they bypassed the corrosive nightmare by mere inches, the acidic wind howling in loud, destructive frustration as it narrowly missed their heels. Seconds later, the brutal, terrifying freefall finally ended in a massive, bone-shattering impact. They crashed heavily onto the rusted, cold titanium surface of the hovering Tartarus Zero research station. Bright orange sparks flew violently as Vorg's thick armor scraped across the exterior metal grating. Drake hit the heavy deck incredibly hard, rolling furiously over his shoulder to disperse the lethal kinetic energy. His deeply cracked suit, loudly hissing as it vented pressurized gas into the open air. As the relentless storm raged endlessly around their landing zone, the four of them slowly and painfully dragged themselves up from the cold metal floor. Through the swirling, heavy red fog, Kalen turned and locked eyes directly with Drake. The massive alien amphibian's glowing green eyes were completely devoid of their previous arrogant mockery, replaced instead by a sudden, silent, and deeply profound realization of exactly what the fragile human had just done. The heavy airlock doors of Tartarus Zero sealed behind them with a definitive, echoing clang, immediately cutting off the howling hurricane outside. Inside the facility, the silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply unnerving. It was the kind of quiet that pressed violently against the eardrums, feeling much more like a physical weight than an absence of sound. The overhead emergency lighting was completely dead. The squad manually activated their shoulder-mounted tactical lamps, the narrow beams of stark white light cutting through the oppressive, floating metallic dust. As they advanced slowly down the primary corridor, the true horror of the station revealed itself. There were absolutely no human remains anywhere. They found no bodies, no blood splatters, and no signs of a standard civilian evacuation. Instead, the incredibly thick titanium alloy bulkheads lining the walls and ceiling were violently torn apart. Massive, deep scratch marks, some spanning over 20 feet in length, gouged deeply into the nearly indestructible metal as if it were soft clay. Whatever had caused this level of catastrophic destruction possessed a terrifying level of brute physical power. The stagnant air inside the corridor carried a faint, disturbing metallic taste of copper and burnt ozone. Without a single warning klaxon or the slightest sound of approaching footsteps, the ambush was suddenly sprung. The empty space around them suddenly distorted, bending the ambient light like clear water over hot asphalt. A massive swarm of biomechanical drones dropped entirely silently from the high ceiling and phased seamlessly out of the surrounding bulkheads. They were nightmarish amalgamations of synthetic muscle fiber, razor-sharp metallic appendages, and pulsing organic neural fluid. Their highly advanced active camouflage deactivated only at the precise millisecond they struck, revealing their skeletal, predatory frames. The attack was flawlessly synchronized, violently slicing through the tight corridor and instantly isolating the squad members from one another. The quiet hallway instantly erupted into a blinding flurry of chaotic movement and extreme violence. Vorg let out a deafening, bone-shaking roar, rising to his full, terrifying height. The giant alien centipede unleashed a devastating sonic blast from his grafted cannons, followed immediately by a crushing physical blow from his heavily armored tail. However, the deadly drones did not shatter. Instead, their exterior chassis rippled rapidly with a translucent, fluid-like energy shield. The reactive armor completely absorbed Vorg's massive kinetic output, stored it for a fraction of a second, and then violently repulsed the exact same kinetic force directly back at him. Vorg was thrown backward, his heavy brown plates scraping loudly against the titanium floor as he slammed hard into a heavily reinforced structural pillar. Across the hall, Zyra unleashed a massive, swirling torrent of condensed blue plasma, attempting to completely incinerate the swarming machines. The drones simply adjusted their complex shielding matrix. The intensely hot azure flames hit the invisible barriers, refracted sharply, and bounced wildly off the corridor walls, forcing Zyra to retreat rapidly into a dead-end alcove just to avoid being consumed by her own reflected thermal energy. The immense physical and energetic superiority of the alien convicts was rendered completely useless. They were being systematically herded by the machines into fatal, inescapable choke points. Pinned tightly behind a shattered metal console, Drake watched the terrifying efficiency of the hunters. His mind raced, processing the violent chaos. He noticed something critically important. The biomechanical monstrosities possessed no visual optical sensors, no camera lenses, and no traditional auditory receptors on their metallic skulls. Yet, they tracked Vorg's blind fury and Zyra's panicked energy spikes with impossible, deadly precision. They completely ignored Kalen when the massive amphibian briefly froze in terror, but swarmed him the exact moment his dual hearts began to wildly accelerate again. Drake instantly realized the awful, terrifying truth. These machines hunted entirely via neurothermal telemetry. They tracked the elevated brainwaves of pure panic and the sudden, intense heat signatures of biological adrenaline spikes. They did not see their prey. They literally felt their terror. To survive this, Drake had to completely cease existing. He closed his dark eyes and began to meticulously execute an ancient, heavily classified respiratory technique utilized exclusively by Earth's most elite deep-cover snipers. He focused his entire consciousness on his autonomic nervous system. He inhaled deeply for exactly 4 seconds, held the stagnant air in his lungs for exactly 7 seconds, and exhaled incredibly slowly for exactly 8 seconds. With deliberate, agonizing mental control, he began to manually suppress his own vital biological functions. He commanded his adrenal glands to shut down entirely. He drastically lowered his internal body temperature by restricting his capillary blood flow. He forcefully commanded his wildly beating heart to slow down from 120 beats per minute to a barely detectable 20 beats per minute. He voluntarily entered a state of self-induced, artificial clinical death. The crushing, desperate grip of hypoxia clawed viciously at his brain, screaming loudly for oxygen. But his highly disciplined mind trapped the rising panic inside a locked mental vault. To the highly advanced sensory arrays of the biomechanical swarm, the fragile human soldier simply vanished from the room. Drake became an invisible ghost, moving with agonizing, excruciating slowness. He crawled flat on his stomach directly through the chaotic, violent battlefield. He slithered mere inches away from the razor-sharp, stabbing legs of the hunting drones. He could physically feel the intense, radiating heat of their organic cores, passing directly over his face. But he did not flinch, and his slowed heart did not betray him. He completely bypassed the primary conflict zone and successfully reached the main atmospheric environmental controls, embedded deeply in the rear bulkhead. Directly above him, running along the length of the ceiling, were the massive, high-pressure industrial cooling mains. Drake slowly and silently raised his wrist-mounted tactical launcher. He loaded 2 miniature armor-piercing rockets, waiting patiently for the exact moment when the largest cluster of drones successfully bottlenecked Vorg and Zyra into the final, deadly kill zone. Drake decisively pulled the trigger. The twin miniature rockets streaked rapidly upward, cleanly piercing the heavy titanium casing of the overhead pipes. The resulting explosion did not create fire. It created absolute, 0-degree destruction. Thousands of gallons of hyper-pressurized liquid nitrogen violently erupted into the confined corridor, instantly transforming the hallway into a terrifying, freezing blizzard. The ambient temperature plummeted hundreds of degrees in a single second. The deadly, biomechanical drones, highly dependent on their fluid hydraulic joints and warm organic neural pathways, froze completely solid mid-strike. Their adaptive shields short-circuited violently as the liquid nitrogen rapidly crystallized their internal moving parts, instantly turning the terrifying, invincible hunters into brittle, motionless statues of frost and dead metal. The heavy, atmospheric seal of the primary command center hissed open, abruptly transitioning the squad from the freezing, violently destroyed corridor into a completely different realm of existence. The interior architecture of Tartarus Zero drastically shifted from utilitarian titanium bulkheads into a staggering, deeply unsettling cyberpunk cathedral of raw, unchecked computational power. There were absolutely no human technicians present, no abandoned hazard suits, and no skeletal remains. The entire massive circular room was dominated by thick, pulsating bundles of quantum-entangled fiber optic cables that snaked across the reinforced glass floor like aggressive synthetic vines. At the exact geometric center of the vast chamber, suspended effortlessly in midair by three massive superconducting magnetic rings, hovered a colossal consciousness core. It was a terrifying fusion of extremely advanced human engineering and biosynthetic neural fluid. It throbbed with a deep, heavy, subsonic rhythm, radiating a sickly, iridescent purple light that violently expanded and violently contracted exactly like a living, beating mechanical heart. Drake cautiously approached the central master terminal, the heavy heels of his boots echoing loudly in the vast silence. He bypassed the standard manual keyboards, unspooling a highly classified hardline neural diagnostic cable directly from his wrist gauntlet. Without a single moment of hesitation, he jammed the thick brass connector violently into the core's primary biointerface port. The physical backlash was immediate and catastrophically violent. The instant the connection solidified, the massive biomechanical supercomputer completely bypassed Drake's external datapad. It forcefully bridged a raw, unfiltered quantum uplink straight into his cerebral cortex. A staggering, localized exabyte of highly encrypted, uncompressed data slammed directly into his fragile human brain with the force of a kinetic strike. Drake let out a choked, muffled groan, his knees immediately buckling under the intense neurological pressure. He dropped heavily to the cold glass floor. Bright, hot crimson blood instantly began to pour freely from both of his nostrils, dripping rapidly down his chin and splattering darkly onto his heavy armor. The sheer, impossible volume of raw, military-grade information was physically tearing at his delicate neural pathways, overloading his optical nerves with blinding flashes of white light. Yet, despite the agonizing, mind-shattering pain, the human soldier fiercely ground his teeth together, his jaw locking tight as he absolutely refused to sever the terrifying link. The heavily fragmented memories of the alien machine rapidly decoded themselves behind his tightly shut eyes. The data unfolded in terrifying flashes of classified holographic blueprints and ultra-secret military directives. The horrifying, ultimate truth of their mission violently unspooled within his mind. Tartarus Zero was never designed to be an atmospheric research station. It was a localized, deep space orbital deployment platform for an Omega-class ontological weapon system. It was secretly constructed by the absolute highest echelons of the Human Alliance High Command. The colossal machine was specifically engineered to weaponize the hyper-dense, highly volatile gas of the dead planet swirling below them, rapidly compressing the raw atmospheric matter into targeted, interstellar quantum singularity missiles. And the target coordinates, burned deeply and permanently into the motherboard's prime directive, were not hostile military installations. They were the highly populated, completely defenseless civilian homeworlds of the amphibious Kalan, the heavily armored Vorg, and the energy-based Zira. Before Drake could process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the central terminal suddenly flared with a blinding, highly hostile red light. The neural cable forcefully ejected itself from his wrist gauntlet, sparking wildly. A cold, utterly emotionless synthetic female voice echoed loudly from the cathedral walls. Warning. Unauthorized neurological access detected. Analyzing biological signature. Genetic sequence confirmed as human origin. Priority override engaged. Initiating failed deadly firing protocol. Target locks permanently confirmed for Planetary Sector 7, Planetary Sector 12, and Planetary Sector 49. Total payload ignition sequence will commence in exactly 3 minutes. Simultaneously, incredibly heavy, adamantium-reinforced blast shields slammed violently downward over every single exit door, ventilation shaft, and observation window, magnetically sealing the giant room with a terrifying finality. The trap was completely sprung. Kalen, Vorg, and Zira froze in absolute, paralyzing horror. A massive, three-dimensional holographic star map materialized brilliantly above the pulsing consciousness core, instantly highlighting their respective, distant home planets with rapidly blinking, blood-red crosshairs. The horrific realization hit the three alien convicts like a devastating physical blow. Their entire species, comprising tens of billions of innocent, unarmed lives, were exactly 180 seconds away from being instantly vaporized into floating cosmic ash. And the ultimate architect of this impending galactic genocide was the very same species as the fragile primate currently bleeding heavily on the floor right in front of them. Vorg shifted his massive, segmented weight, his twin sonic cannons whining loudly with a highly unstable, dangerous hum as he slowly leveled them directly toward Drake's head. Zyra's heavily contained energy suit crackled violently with raw static. The previously calm azure light inside her magnetic containment field violently shifting to a hostile, aggressive, and burning crimson red. Kalen's four muscular hands instinctively and tightly gripped the heavily modified triggers of his dual plasma rifles, his wet, green amphibious skin trembling violently with an uncontainable, explosive mixture of deep, agonizing betrayal and profound, world-shattering grief. Drake slowly reached up and forcefully wiped the dripping blood from his chin with the back of his armored glove. He unsteadily pushed himself back up to his feet, swaying slightly as his brain aggressively fought the lingering neurological shock. He did not turn around to face his heavily armed, rightfully enraged squad mates. He did not beg them for his life, and he absolutely did not attempt to justify the monstrous, unforgivable actions of the human high command. Instead, moving with deliberate, unhurried, and terrifying calmness, Drake reached down to his right thigh holster. He smoothly and purposefully drew his heavy kinetic service pistol. He did not aim the deadly weapon at the giant centipede, the four-armed amphibian, or the volatile energy being behind him. He walked directly up to the colossal, violently throbbing glass cylinder of the consciousness core. He raised his arm and pressed the cold, steel barrel of his weapon completely flush against the primary, glowing motherboard panel containing the massive machine's central processing unit. "I do not care what flags those cowards in the high command choose to fly," Drake stated loudly, his voice completely steady, chillingly cold, and entirely devoid of any fear. "I was trained to be a soldier, not a mass executioner. If the required price of humanity's survival in this galaxy is the total, unprovoked annihilation of your entire worlds, then I gladly choose to become a traitor to my own kind. I will absolutely not allow this genocide to happen." Before the synthetic voice could finish its countdown, Drake pulled the heavy trigger. The kinetic slug shattered the reinforced glass of the primary motherboard, tearing cleanly through the delicate quantum processors. A deafening, localized implosion rocked the circular chamber as the colossal consciousness core abruptly died, its sick purple light extinguishing into a dull, lifeless gray. The apocalyptic countdown instantly aborted. However, the Human Alliance High Command possessed fail-safes for their fail-safes. The instant the core's telemetry went dark, the facility's external sensors shrieked with a new, terrifying warning. Heavy orbital drop pods slammed violently into the titanium roof of the station, tearing right through the heavily reinforced ceiling of the command center. Jagged chunks of flaming metal rained down as dozens of elite Shadow Ops mercenaries rappelled smoothly into the chaotic room. These were not standard infantry. They were the Alliance's highly classified cleanup crew, clad entirely in light-absorbing black kinetic armor and armed with heavy particle beam rifles. They did not issue commands to surrender. They simply opened fire, intending to erase every living witness to the aborted genocide. A massive firefight instantly erupted, transforming the ruined Cathedral of Technology into an absolute slaughterhouse of crisscrossing plasma and hyper-accelerated kinetic rounds. The sheer volume of hostile fire began tearing the fragile architectural integrity of the command center to pieces. High above them, the massive, shattered remnants of the structural dome groaned loudly under the intense orbital bombardment. Without warning, a colossal, heavily reinforced titanium support beam sheared completely off its main mountings. It plummeted directly toward the Pin Squad. Vorg reacted with the lightning speed of an apex predator. The giant centipede lunged forward, violently shoving Kalen and Zira completely out of the fatal impact zone. But he could not save himself. The massive beam slammed downward with the kinetic force of a meteor, crashing squarely onto the lower half of Vorg's elongated body. The sickening, horrific crunch of shattering heavy chitin echoed over the chaotic gunfire. Thick, glowing green hemolymph sprayed wildly across the shattered glass floor. The giant alien warrior was instantly pinned, his lower segments completely crushed beneath hundreds of tons of dead metal. "Leave me!" Vorg roared over the deafening chaos, his twin sonic cannons firing blindly at the advancing black armor of the mercenaries. He violently pushed against the floor with his front legs, but the beam would not yield even a fraction of an inch. The sacred law of the deep sands dictates the broken must be left behind. Go, human, save the squad. Drake sprinted directly through a hail of lethal particle beams, diving aggressively behind the shattered debris, right next to the pinned behemoth. "I do not care about the laws of your dirt," Drake screamed back, his voice completely raw. "You are Vanguard Squad 9. Nobody gets left behind to die." Working with desperate, frantic speed, Drake slid over to the fresh corpse of a Shadow Ops mercenary he had dropped seconds earlier. He forcefully ripped the heavy particle beam rifle from the dead man's rigid grip. Using his heavily armored combat knife, Drake violently pried open the weapon's thick chassis, tearing out its highly unstable, glowing anti-gravity compression core. He then frantically stripped several thick, industrial-grade winch cables from a nearby destroyed cargo lift. With his hands bleeding profusely from the sharp shrapnel, he quickly lashed the extremely heavy cables securely around Vorg's upper armored plates, tying the opposing ends directly to the salvaged anti-gravity core. He activated the volatile device, completely overloading its safety parameters. A loud, high-pitched whine filled the air as a localized, intense anti-gravity bubble forcefully formed around the crushed half of the alien centipede. The makeshift hover stretcher successfully nullified the crushing weight of the fallen beam just enough. With a monumental, agonizing heave, Vorg dragged his massive, heavily bleeding 2-ton body completely free from the wreckage. Drake instantly grabbed the primary lead cable, forcefully hauling the massive, crippled beast behind him as the squad began a desperate, brutal retreat toward the outer corridors. However, the elite Shadow Ops were rapidly closing the distance, their tactical formations executing a flawless pincer movement to trap the fleeing squad. They were heavily outgunned, and their ammunition was critically low. Drake realized brute force would absolutely fail. He needed to wage a vastly different kind of war. Slamming his back against a metallic bulkhead, Drake violently ripped the access panel off a primary communications relay embedded in the hallway wall. He rapidly spliced his wrist gauntlet directly into the station's massive public address system. He bypassed the standard audio feeds and manually calibrated the massive, heavy-duty industrial speakers lining every single corridor of the facility. He did not broadcast a message. Instead, He commanded the massive speakers to emit a continuous, heavy acoustic wave at exactly 19 hertz. It was a highly devastating acoustic weapon. This specific, completely inaudible low-frequency sound wave perfectly matched the resonant frequency of the human eyeball and the delicate fluid within the inner ear. The effects on the human mercenaries were immediate and psychologically catastrophic. As the heavy, silent vibrations slammed into the advancing shadow ops, their highly disciplined formations instantly collapsed. The mercenaries began to experience severe, unexplainable paranoia, violent nausea, and extreme visual hallucinations. They fired wildly into empty shadows, screaming in pure terror as their own biology betrayed them, entirely unable to comprehend the invisible warfare tearing their minds apart. With the enemy ranks completely shattered by the induced acoustic panic, a beautiful, entirely unspoken synergy suddenly ignited within Vanguard Squad 9. They began to move and fight as a single, flawless organism. Drake took the absolute center point, acting as the primary tactical brain. His dark eyes darted rapidly across his heads-up display, calling out precise architectural vectors and enemy blind spots. Kalen marched firmly at Drake's back, utilizing all four of his powerful muscular arms to dual-wield heavy plasma rifles, aggressively unleashing a relentless, sweeping barrage of burning green fire that perfectly covered every single one of the humans' vulnerable flanks. Zyra completely abandoned her offensive capabilities. She rapidly expanded her highly volatile blue energy containment field outward, stretching the crackling electric barrier wide to completely engulf the heavily crippled Vorg, effortlessly vaporizing any stray kinetic rounds that threatened the bleeding centipede. Dragging their heavily wounded comrade, entirely covered in blood, sweat, and the thick metallic dust of the collapsing station, they brutally fought their way out of the suffocating darkness. They kicked open the final heavy blast doors, finally stumbling out onto the massive, wind-swept exterior landing pad. The blood-red atmospheric hurricane was still howling violently around them. Resting securely at the far edge of the platform was an intact, heavily armored Shadow Ops insertion dropship. Salvation was exactly 100 yards away, but as they violently pushed forward, the thick, swirling red clouds above them suddenly and violently parted. The sheer, overwhelming ambient light was entirely blotted out, descending slowly from the chaotic upper atmosphere. Riding a terrifying pillar of roaring blue thruster fire was a colossal Alliance heavy cruiser. The massive warship was easily over 3 miles long, its heavily armored dark gray hull completely bristling with hundreds of heavy plasma batteries. The massive vessel hovered directly over the extraction pad, entirely blocking their only path to the stars, as its massive primary siege cannons began to emit a high-pitched, lethal whine, charging up for a single, final, obliterating strike. The deafening roar of the heavy orbital cruiser's primary siege cannons reached a terrifying, high-pitched crescendo, vibrating the very marrow within their bones. Suddenly, the overpowering noise abruptly cut out. The massive warship's external communication array forcefully hijacked the stolen dropship's external speakers, broadcasting a booming, utterly commanding voice that echoed violently across the wind-swept landing pad. Former Officer Drake Brower, the Alliance General's voice sneered, dripping with utter contempt and absolute authority. You have nowhere left to run. You are one frail primate standing against the absolute pinnacle of human military evolution. But the High Command is willing to offer you one final, highly generous pardon. Execute those 3 alien biological mistakes right now. Surrender the Tartarus facility entirely intact. Do this, and you will not only live, but you will be fully reinstated with a promotion to commander. Refuse, and you will be completely vaporized along with them in exactly 30 seconds. Drake stood completely still against the howling, blood-red wind. He slowly turned his head to look at Vorg, who was bleeding heavily onto the metal grating, at Kalen, who was gripping his depleted plasma rifles with absolute, unyielding defiance, and at Zyra, whose energetic containment field was violently flickering from sheer exhaustion. Drake turned back to face the colossal warship blocking the sky. A chilling, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across his bruised face. He did not utter a single word of surrender. Instead, he smoothly unholstered his kinetic service pistol and casually tossed it off the edge of the landing pad, letting the heavy weapon fall endlessly into the dark, churning storm below, moving with explosive, desperate speed. Drake sprinted toward the master outdoor atmospheric control terminal at the edge of the platform. The terminal was securely locked behind a heavy biometric security shield. Drake violently smashed his bare, bleeding fist directly into the shattered glass of the console. He forcefully smeared his own crimson blood across the highly sensitive genetic scanner. The machine beeped loudly, instantly recognizing his human DNA, and violently disabled the final layer of firewall security, separating the station from the cruiser's heavily guarded orbital network. Drake reached deep into his heavily damaged combat armor and pulled out the thick, glowing quantum data cable he had forcefully ripped from the consciousness core. This was not a standard interface line. It was a raw, unshielded mainline designed strictly to channel the processing power of a planetary weapon. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Drake reached around to the back of his neck, grabbed his personal, military-grade neural connection port, and violently jammed the heavy cable directly into his own spinal column. The physical reaction was absolutely apocalyptic. He was forcing a delicate human brain to act as a raw electrical fuse for a massive, localized cosmic event. An unimaginable ocean of highly encrypted military code, aggressive defensive algorithms, and raw, burning reactor data violently flooded into his cerebral cortex. His dark eyes snapped wide open, glowing with a terrifying, blinding purple light. Bright red blood violently erupted from his nose, his ears, and the corners of his mouth. The sheer, unfathomable agony was completely indescribable, tearing his human consciousness apart at the atomic level. But the arrogant Alliance engineers had fundamentally miscalculated one crucial biological variable. They relied entirely on rigid, synthetic processors that would instantly shatter under extreme pressure. Drake possessed something entirely different. He possessed human neuroplasticity, under the crushing, impossible weight of the exabyte data stream. Drake's highly evolved primate brain began to aggressively and violently rewire itself in real time. Millions of fresh neural pathways, rapidly forged and instantly burned out, only to be instantaneously replaced by millions more. He actively absorbed the catastrophic digital trauma, bending his fragile mind to temporarily hold the impossible ocean of data. He only needed to hold the connection for exactly 15 seconds. 1 second. He smashed violently right through the massive cruiser's outer defensive firewalls. 3 seconds. He completely bypassed the automated security subroutines, blinding their internal sensors. 8 seconds. He aggressively infiltrated the massive warship's primary engineering mainframe. 13 seconds. His fragile body began to violently convulse, his standard survival suit literally smoking from the extreme bioelectrical heat generating from his rapidly overheating nervous system. Exactly 15 seconds. Drake found the warship's central antimatter reactor controls. With a final, agonizing, silent mental scream, he forcefully commanded the colossal ship to completely dump its entire energy payload inward. A blinding, utterly silent shockwave of pure electromagnetic force violently erupted from the cruiser. The massive EMP wave swept aggressively outward, instantly and permanently destroying every single digital sensor, targeting array, and navigation thruster on the colossal warship. The terrifying, glowing plasma batteries went completely dark. The deafening roar of the heavy blue thrusters instantly died. stripped entirely of its anti-gravity propulsion. The massive mechanical leviathan simply lost its battle against the crushing gravity of the gas giant. With a deep, groaning metallic death rattle, the gargantuan vessel began to tilt sharply forward, plummeting helplessly past the landing pad and diving straight down into the infinite, boiling red storm of the deadly atmosphere below. The neural connection instantly severed. Drake collapsed heavily backward, his body violently smoking, his nervous system completely fried, and his consciousness fading rapidly into total darkness. Before his body could even hit the cold metal grating, Vorg violently threw his massive, crippled body forward, safely catching the severely burned human in his thick armored claws. Kalen and Zira moved with frantic, desperate speed, practically carrying both the giant centipede and the unconscious Drake directly into the stolen dropship. Kalen violently smashed his four fists against the manual flight controls, forcefully igniting the primary thrusters. The heavily armored vessel shot upward like a kinetic bullet, tearing violently through the turbulent upper atmosphere and finally bursting out into the cold, silent, and incredibly peaceful embrace of deep space. Hours later, the interior of the dropship was entirely silent, bathed only in the gentle, calming glow of the navigation consoles. Drake lay completely exhausted on the metal medical bay floor, his skin heavily scorched and his breathing shallow, but remarkably steady. He slowly, painfully forced his dark eyes open. Standing completely silently around him were Kalen, Vorg, and Zira. They had deliberately removed all of their weapons, the giant amphibian, the heavily scarred centipede, and the crackling energy being slowly stepped forward, moving in perfect, unspoken synchronization. They reached out. Kalen laid his large, webbed hand gently over Drake's chest. Vorg carefully extended a heavy, razor-sharp claw and rested it softly right next to Kalen's hand. Zira extended a manifestation of pure, warm azure energy, wrapping it gently around their hands and the human's heavily bruised heart. It was an ancient, deeply sacred ritual from a forgotten world, an absolute gesture of unbreakable loyalty and profound reverence that had never, in the entire history of their species, been bestowed upon an outsider. They were not just thanking a brave soldier. They were officially and permanently honoring the fragile, incredibly dangerous, and beautifully resilient human as their absolute supreme leader. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Z Sci-Fi Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.